I never imagined that the same family who banned me from their sacred Christmas Eve tradition would be sitting in my courtroom 3 weeks later, watching their golden boy's son face serious DUI charges while I held the gavel. The look of absolute horror on Patricia Thompson's perfectly botoxed face when she realized that the Honorable Judge Jessica Martinez was the same daughter-in-law they had so coldly excluded from their family gathering was a moment I'll treasure forever. But that moment of poetic justice became the catalyst that transformed me from a people-pleasing wife, desperate for acceptance, into a woman who finally understood that respect isn't earned through submission, it's commanded through boundaries. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The prestigious Thompson family estate in Riverside's Hillcrest neighborhood stood like a monument to old money privilege, its colonial columns and manicured gardens reflecting 4 generations of real estate development success. As I pulled my modest Honda Civic into the circular driveway that December evening, surrounded by luxury vehicles that cost more than my annual salary, I felt the familiar knot of anxiety that had become my constant companion during family gatherings. The warm glow emanating from the tall windows should have felt welcoming, but instead, it reminded me of an exclusive club where I would forever remain an outsider looking in. David Thompson, my husband of 4 years, stepped out of the passenger seat with the easy confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in any room he entered. His sandy brown hair was perfectly styled, his navy blazer pressed to perfection, and his smile carried the casual entitlement that came from growing up as the middle child in Riverside County's most influential real estate dynasty. I watched him straighten his tie, a nervous habit he'd developed whenever we visited his parents. Though his anxiety stemmed from different concerns than mine, where I worried about acceptance and belonging, David worried about maintaining the carefully constructed image of success he'd built around our relationship. "Remember what we discussed, Jess?" he said, his voice carrying that tone of gentle correction I'd grown to recognize over the years. "Let's keep things light tonight. No shop talk about court cases or legal precedents. Mom has been planning this Christmas Eve dinner for months, and you know how she feels about bringing work into family time." His words were delivered with a smile, but the underlying message was clear. Be less of who you are and more of who they want you to be. I nodded automatically, adjusting the modest black dress I'd chosen specifically because Patricia Thompson had once mentioned that bright colors were inappropriate for evening family gatherings. The dress was beautiful but conservative, purchased from a department store rather than the boutique designers Patricia favored, and I'd paired it with simple pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother. As a superior court judge, I commanded respect and authority in my professional life. But here in the Thompson sphere of influence, I felt diminished to the role of David's wife, who happened to have a job that made dinner conversation awkward. The front door opened before we could knock, revealing Patricia Thompson in all her intimidating glory. At 58, she maintained the kind of ageless beauty that required significant financial investment and meticulous maintenance. Her silver hair was swept into an elegant chignon. Her emerald green cocktail dress probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, and her smile held the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to social performances. Behind her stood Robert Thompson, a distinguished man in his early 60s whose presence filled any room he entered. His success in real estate development had been built on an uncanny ability to read people in situations, and his piercing, gray eyes seemed to catalog and assess everything they encountered. "David, darling," Patricia cooed, embracing her son with genuine affection before turning to me with a considerably cooler demeanor. "Jessica, how lovely to see you. I do hope you'll remember that tonight is about family tradition, not courtroom drama." Her words were delivered with the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes, and I felt the familiar sting of being subtly put in my place before I'd even crossed the threshold. The Thompson family Christmas Eve tradition was legendary. In their social circle, a carefully orchestrated evening that had been refined over 25 years into something approaching theatrical perfection. The guest list was limited to immediate family members. The menu never varied from Patricia's grandmother's recipes, and every detail from table settings to conversation topics followed established protocols that had been passed down like sacred law. As David's wife, I had been included for the past 3 years, but always with the understanding that I was a guest rather than true family, someone who needed to earn my place through careful behavior and appropriate responses. The formal dining room was decorated with understated elegance that screamed expensive taste rather than festive celebration. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over mahogany furniture that had been in the Thompson family for generations, and the table was set with china that Patricia had informed me was worth more than most people's cars. Fresh white roses and silver accents created a sophisticated ambiance that felt more like a corporate dinner than a family celebration, and I noticed that my place card positioned me at the far end of the table, away from the family's inner circle of conversation. Michael Thompson arrived 20 minutes late, as was his custom, bringing with him the kind of careless energy that had always made him Patricia's obvious favorite. At 26, he possessed the Thompson good looks and natural charm, but without the discipline or direction that had made his father successful. His recent law school graduation had been celebrated with great fanfare, though his actual academic performance had been a carefully guarded family secret. Michael worked at the family firm in a position that seemed to involve more networking than actual legal work, and his lifestyle suggested access to funds that far exceeded his stated salary. "Sorry, I'm running behind," Michael announced cheerfully, kissing his mother's cheek and accepting the scotch his father handed him without question. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Traffic was absolutely insane coming back from Los Angeles. You'd think people would stay home on Christmas Eve, but apparently everyone had the same idea I did. His explanation was delivered with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he'd never faced real consequences for his actions, and I noticed the slight glassy quality in his eyes that might have been alcohol or might have been something else entirely. Sarah Thompson Clark, David's older sister, arrived with her husband, Greg, and their twin 8-year-old daughters, creating the kind of picture-perfect family tableau that Patricia loved to showcase. Sarah worked part-time at an art gallery, a job that provided social credibility without the demanding schedule that might interfere with family obligations, and Greg managed investments for high-net-worth clients, making him an acceptable addition to the Thompson legacy. Their daughters, Emma and Sophie, were dressed in matching red velvet dresses and had been coached in the kind of polite behavior that would earn adult approval throughout the evening. As we gathered around the dining table, I found myself studying the family dynamics with the analytical skills that had served me well in my legal career. The Thompson family operated with clearly defined hierarchies and unspoken rules that governed everything from conversation topics to seating arrangements. Robert commanded respect through his business success and financial control. Patricia wielded influence through social connections and family tradition management. Sarah maintained her position through conformity and producing the next generation of Thompson heirs. And Michael held his place as the charming favorite whose potential would someday surely be realized. David occupied a more complicated position as the middle child who had married outside the family's preferred social circle. His choice to become a marketing consultant rather than joining the family business had been grudgingly accepted, but his marriage to a woman from a middle-class Mexican-American family remained a source of ongoing concern that was never directly addressed, but always subtly present. I represented an unknown variable in their carefully controlled family equation, someone whose professional success couldn't be dismissed, but whose cultural background and independent streak made them uncomfortable. The dinner conversation flowed along predictable channels, touching on safe topics like real estate market trends, upcoming social events, and the girls' school performances. I contributed when appropriate, offering observations that demonstrated my intelligence without overwhelming the discussion, and I carefully avoided mentioning my work unless directly asked. The few times my judicial position came up, the responses were polite but distant, as if my career existed in a separate sphere that had little relevance to their lives. "Jessica must see such interesting cases," Patricia observed during a lull in conversation, her tone suggesting that interesting was not necessarily a positive quality. "I imagine the criminal justice system provides quite an education in human nature, though I do worry about the kind of people you encounter on a daily basis. It must be challenging to maintain appropriate boundaries when dealing with such unsavory characters." Her comment carried multiple layers of subtle criticism wrapped in apparent concern. She was simultaneously questioning my judgment in choosing such a career, expressing doubt about my ability to handle the responsibilities involved, and implying that my work environment might somehow contaminate me in ways that could affect my fitness for polite society. I felt David's hand briefly touch mine under the table, a warning to tread carefully rather than a gesture of support. "The law provides structure and fairness that helps everyone," I replied diplomatically, keeping my voice neutral and my response brief. "Most people want to do the right thing when they understand what's expected of them." It was a safe answer that avoided any mention of the serious crimes I regularly dealt with, the complex legal precedents I helped establish, or the significant impact my decisions had on people's lives and futures. Michael leaned forward with the kind of casual interest that suggested he was more affected by the alcohol than he wanted to admit. "But don't you ever get frustrated with all the technicalities and procedures? I mean, sometimes it must be obvious that someone is guilty, but you have to let them go because of some legal loophole or constitutional issue. That must be incredibly frustrating for someone who wants to see justice done." His question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how the judicial system actually worked, but more importantly, it demonstrated the kind of entitled thinking that assumed rules and procedures were obstacles to be overcome rather than protections to be respected. I chose my response carefully, aware that anything too detailed or passionate would be seen as inappropriate dinner conversation. "The procedures exist to protect everyone's rights," I explained simply. "Due process isn't a technicality, it's the foundation that ensures fair treatment, regardless of someone's background or circumstances. It's actually quite elegant when you understand how all the pieces work together." Again, I kept my response measured and brief, though I could have spoken for hours about the beauty and complexity of constitutional law and the careful balance required to protect both individual rights and community safety. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I noticed Michael's continued interest in legal matters, particularly those involving drunk driving laws and enforcement procedures. His questions seemed casual enough, but there was an underlying current of concern that made me wonder if his interest was more than academic. When he asked about the differences between various types of impaired driving charges, I provided basic information while noting his particular focus on sentencing guidelines and potential consequences for first-time offenders. As the evening progressed, I found myself occupying the familiar role of interested observer rather than active participant. The Thompson family's conversations followed well-established patterns, touching on business successes, social obligations, and future plans that always seem to involve expanding their influence and maintaining their position in Riverside County's elite circles. The Christmas Eve announcement had stripped away all my illusions and forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. I had been trying to earn something that was never actually available to me. The Thompson family's acceptance wasn't based on merit, behavior, or personal qualities. It was based on bloodline, social class, and cultural background, criteria I could never meet regardless of my achievements or efforts. My judicial position, my educational credentials, my professional reputation, none of these accomplishments mattered when measured against their fundamental belief that I didn't belong in their elevated social sphere. As the holidays passed and January arrived with its return to normal routines, I threw myself into my judicial duties with renewed focus and energy. The courthouse provided a refuge where my authority was unquestioned, my decisions carried real weight, and my background was considered an asset rather than a liability. Judge Eleanor Hayes, my mentor and the chief judge of our district, had often told me that diversity in the judiciary strengthened the entire system by bringing different perspectives and experiences to legal decision-making. In my courtroom, I was valued for exactly the qualities the Thompson family found problematic: my independence, my analytical thinking, and my refusal to simply accept traditional authority without question. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same family who questioned my fitness for their social gatherings lived in a community that my judicial decisions directly affected. Riverside County's legal system touched every aspect of local life, from business regulations to family disputes to criminal proceedings, and my role in shaping those outcomes carried far more genuine influence than any social positioning the Thompsons might achieve through their charity work and networking events. The weeks following the Christmas Eve dinner passed in a strange state of suspended animation, where life continued its normal rhythms while something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. David attempted to return to our usual routines, as if nothing significant had occurred, discussing weekend plans and work schedules with the same casual ease he'd always maintained. His ability to compartmentalize the family situation both amazed and disturbed me, revealing a capacity for emotional detachment that I was only beginning to fully understand. Our conversations about the holiday incident followed a predictable pattern that grew more frustrating with each repetition. David would acknowledge that his mother's announcement had been poorly timed and perhaps insensitively delivered, but he consistently framed it as a communication issue rather than a fundamental problem with the family's values and treatment of me. When I tried to explain how deeply the exclusion had hurt, he would respond with practical suggestions about alternative holiday arrangements, or remind me of the positive aspects of his family's acceptance in other areas. "You're taking this too personally, Jess," became his standard response whenever I attempted to discuss the deeper implications of what had happened. "My mother has always been particular about family traditions. It's not about you specifically. She's just trying to preserve something that's been important to our family for decades. Maybe we can talk to her about creating a new tradition that includes everyone, something that feels fresh and inclusive." His suggestions always involved me doing additional emotional labor to solve a problem I hadn't created, finding ways to accommodate his family's preferences while they made no corresponding effort to accommodate mine. The underlying assumption in all his proposals was that I needed to be more flexible, more understanding, more willing to accept their limitations, rather than expecting them to examine their own behavior or attitudes. Work became my sanctuary during this period, providing clear structure and purpose that contrasted sharply with the ambiguous dynamics of my personal life. The courthouse operated according to established rules and procedures that applied equally to everyone, regardless of their background or social connections. In my judicial robes, I commanded respect that was based on my position, my knowledge, and my decision-making abilities, rather than my willingness to conform to someone else's expectations about appropriate behavior. Judge Eleanor Hayes noticed the increased intensity I was bringing to my work, though she was too diplomatic to pry into personal matters without invitation. During one of our regular coffee meetings in her chambers, she made an observation that resonated more deeply than she probably realized at the time. "You've seemed particularly focused lately, Jessica," she noted, stirring cream into her coffee while studying my face with the kind of perceptive attention that had made her such an effective jurist. "I hope you're finding time to take care of yourself outside of work. This job can be consuming, especially when we're dealing with difficult cases that touch on issues of fairness and justice. Sometimes the most challenging part isn't making the right legal decision, but managing our own emotional responses to systemic problems we can't solve from the bench." Her words carried layers of meaning that I suspected came from her own experiences, navigating professional success while managing personal challenges. Judge Hayes had broken significant barriers during her career, becoming the first Latina chief judge in our district, despite facing obstacles that were rarely discussed openly, but were evident to anyone who understood the demographics of our legal system. Her mentorship had been invaluable, not just for technical legal guidance, but for modeling how to maintain professional integrity while dealing with environments that didn't always welcome diverse perspectives. I've been thinking a lot about the intersection between personal dignity and professional responsibility, I replied carefully, not wanting to burden her with my domestic problems, but grateful for the opportunity to process my thoughts with someone who might understand the complexity of my situation. How do we maintain our effectiveness in roles that require impartiality when we're dealing with personal experiences that affect our perspective on fairness and justice? She nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the deeper question beneath my words. The key is understanding that our personal experiences inform our judgment without compromising our professional obligations. A good judge brings their full humanity to the bench while maintaining the discipline to apply the law consistently. Your background and experiences don't disqualify you from making fair decisions. They actually enhance your ability to understand the human complexities involved in legal disputes. Our conversation was interrupted by Maria Rodriguez, my court clerk, who knocked softly before entering with the day's case files. Maria had worked in the courthouse for 15 years and possessed the kind of institutional knowledge that made her invaluable to new judges, learning to navigate both the formal procedures and informal protocols that governed daily operations. Her efficiency and discretion had earned my deep respect, and I'd come to rely on her insights about local legal patterns and community dynamics. "Judge Martinez," Maria said, placing a stack of files on my desk while maintaining the formal demeanor she used in professional settings. "I have tomorrow's docket ready for your review. There's one case that might require additional preparation time. People versus Michael Thompson, a DUI charge with some complicating factors that could make it more complex than the standard plea arrangement." The name hit me like a physical blow, though I maintained my composure through years of training. In courtroom neutrality, Michael Thompson, my brother-in-law, the golden boy of the Thompson family who had arrived late to Christmas Eve, dinner with glassy eyes and alcohol on his breath, who had asked me detailed questions about DUI penalties and sentencing guidelines while claiming casual academic interest in the legal system. "What are the specifics of the case?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil beginning to churn in my stomach. Maria consulted her notes with professional efficiency, unaware of the personal connections that made this routine case assignment feel like a cosmic joke. "Arrested December 27th on Pacific Coast Highway near Malibu. Blood alcohol. Content of 0.14, which is significantly above the legal limit. Initial charge is driving under the influence with enhancements for excessive speed and reckless endangerment. The defendant has retained Thomas Mitchell as counsel, and they've requested a jury trial rather than accepting the standard plea agreement. Mr. Mitchell has already filed several preliminary motions challenging the traffic stop and breathalyzer procedures." The details painted a picture that was both shocking and sadly predictable. Michael had been arrested just 3 days after the family dinner, where he'd been drinking and asking pointed questions about DUI laws. His blood alcohol level indicated serious impairment, and the additional charges suggested dangerous behavior that could have resulted in injury or death to innocent people. The fact that he had hired Thomas Mitchell, one of the county's most expensive defense attorneys, indicated that the Thompson family was treating this as a serious threat to their reputation and Michael's future prospects. Judge Hayes had been listening to our exchange with the kind of neutral attention she brought to all legal discussions, but I noticed a slight shift in her posture that suggested she was picking up on undercurrents in the conversation. "Is there any conflict of interest we need to address, Jessica?" she asked diplomatically, giving me an opening to recuse myself if necessary without requiring detailed explanations. The question forced me to confront the ethical implications of the situation immediately, rather than allowing me time to process the emotional aspects privately. As a judge, I had clear professional obligations that superseded personal considerations, but I also needed to ensure that my ability to remain impartial wouldn't be compromised by family dynamics or emotional conflicts. "The defendant is my brother-in-law," I admitted, appreciating Judge Hayes's direct approach to what could have been an awkward situation. I should recuse myself and request case reassignment to avoid any appearance of impropriety. The words felt strange as I spoke them, referring to Michael in formal legal terms rather than as the family member whose behavior had caused me years of minor irritation and concern. Maria nodded and made notes about initiating the recusal process, but Judge Hayes held up a hand to pause the administrative procedures. Before we automatically assume recusal is necessary, let's consider the full situation. How close is your relationship with the defendant? Do you socialize regularly, share financial interests, or have any personal conflicts that might affect your judgment? Her questions forced me to examine the reality of my relationship with Michael, rather than simply accepting the surface assumption that family connections automatically created conflicts of interest. The truth was that Michael and I had never been particularly close, despite 4 years of marriage to his brother. Our interactions had been limited to family gatherings where conversation remained superficial, and we had no shared interests, business relationships, or personal history that might influence my legal judgment. More significantly, the recent Christmas Eve dinner had effectively severed whatever minimal family bonds might have existed between us. The Thompson family had made it clear that I was not truly part of their inner circle, that my presence at family events was temporary and conditional rather than permanent and valued. In essence, they had created the very distance that now allowed me to approach Michael's case with professional detachment rather than familial loyalty. Our relationship is quite limited, I explained, choosing my words carefully to provide accurate information without revealing the personal pain behind my assessment. We interact only at family gatherings, have no shared financial interests, and no personal conflicts that would affect my ability to judge his case fairly based solely on legal merits and evidence presented in court. Judge Hayes nodded slowly, understanding both the spoken and unspoken elements of my response. In that case, I think you should handle the case yourself. Recusal should be reserved for situations where actual conflicts exist, not simply because of distant family connections. You're fully capable of maintaining professional standards regardless of personal relationships, and the legal system functions best when experienced judges handle cases rather than automatically passing them to colleagues. Her decision surprised me, though I recognized the wisdom in her reasoning. Recusal was indeed meant for situations involving genuine conflicts of interest rather than theoretical ones, and my professional training had prepared me to separate personal feelings from legal obligations. More importantly, her confidence in my ability to handle the situation professionally was both challenging and validating, forcing me to rely on my judicial skills rather than avoiding the complexity of the situation. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine administrative tasks and case reviews, but Michael's file remained at the center of my thoughts as I prepared for what promised to be an unprecedented test of my professional composure. That evening, I drove home through Riverside's familiar streets, noting how different the landscape looked when viewed through the lens of my new knowledge about Michael's arrest and upcoming trial. David was waiting in our living room when I arrived, his posture and expression immediately alerting me that he had news to share. He stood as I entered, moving with the kind of nervous energy that had become increasingly common whenever family issues arose between us. His usual confident demeanor was replaced by an uncertainty that made him seem younger and more vulnerable than the successful marketing professional he presented to the world. "Jess, we need to talk," he began, running, his hand through his hair in a gesture I recognized as his way of buying time when faced with difficult conversations. "Something has happened with Michael, and the family is hoping you might be able to provide some guidance about how to handle the legal aspects." His words were carefully chosen, suggesting that this conversation had been planned and perhaps even rehearsed with input from other family members. I sat down across from him, maintaining the neutral expression I used in professional settings while my mind raced through the implications of his request. The Thompson family's sudden interest In my legal expertise created a fascinating contrast with their recent exclusion of me from their family traditions. Apparently, my professional skills were valuable enough to seek out when they needed help, even though my personal presence was unwelcome at their social gatherings. "What kind of legal situation are we discussing?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. David's relief at my apparent willingness to engage with the topic was visible as he leaned forward and began explaining the circumstances surrounding Michael's arrest. His version of events differed significantly from the official police report Maria had summarized earlier. According to David's account, Michael had been the victim of an overzealous traffic stop conducted without proper justification, and the subsequent DUI charges were based on flawed breathalyzer equipment and improper procedures. The Thompson family viewed this as a clear case of prosecutorial overreach targeting a successful young professional, and they were confident that proper legal representation would expose the weaknesses in the state's case. Thomas Mitchell thinks there are several viable defense strategies, David continued, his tone suggesting that he was repeating information he'd received from other family members rather than expressing his own legal analysis. The traffic stop might have been unconstitutional. The breathalyzer machine hadn't been properly calibrated, and Michael's blood alcohol reading could be challenged based on timing and testing procedures. The family is optimistic that the charges will be reduced or dismissed entirely once these issues are properly presented to the court. I listened to his explanation with growing amazement at the narrative the Thompson family had constructed around Michael's arrest. Their version transformed a straightforward case of drunk driving into a complex story of victimization and procedural violations, allowing them to maintain their belief in Michael's innocence while positioning themselves as defenders of constitutional rights rather than enablers of dangerous behavior. "What specific guidance is the family hoping I can provide?" I asked, curious about whether they understood the ethical limitations of my position or simply assumed that family loyalty would override professional obligations. David's response revealed both their desperation and their fundamental misunderstanding of judicial ethics and responsibilities. "Well, you know the local legal system better than Thomas Mitchell does," he explained, his voice carrying a tone of reasonable expectation that made his request seem perfectly logical rather than completely inappropriate. "You could probably give us insights about which judges might be assigned to the case, what their typical approaches are to DUI cases, and what strategies tend to be most effective in our local courts. The family would really appreciate any guidance you could offer to help Michael through this difficult situation." The audacity of his request was breathtaking in its complete disregard for legal ethics and professional boundaries. David was essentially asking me to provide inside information about the judicial system to help his brother escape consequences for behavior that had endangered public safety. He seemed genuinely surprised when I didn't immediately agree to help, as if family loyalty should automatically override my professional obligations and personal integrity. "David, I can't provide that kind of assistance," I said firmly, my voice carrying the authority I used in courtroom settings when attorneys attempted to argue inappropriate positions. "What you're describing would constitute a serious breach of judicial ethics and could result in sanctions, removal from the bench, and potential criminal charges for corruption. I took an oath to uphold the law impartially, and that means I can't use my position to benefit family members or anyone else." His face flushed with disappointment and frustration as he realized that his carefully planned request was being rejected. "But this isn't about corruption or special favors," he protested, his tone carrying the kind of wounded incredulity that suggested he genuinely didn't understand why I was being unreasonable. "This is about family helping family during a crisis. Michael made a mistake, but he doesn't deserve to have his entire future destroyed over one bad decision. You have knowledge and connections that could help him navigate this situation more effectively. Isn't that what family members do for each other?" His response revealed the fundamental disconnect between his understanding of family loyalty and my understanding of professional integrity. In David's worldview, family obligations superseded other considerations, and my refusal to help Michael suggested a lack of proper loyalty rather than adherence to ethical standards. He couldn't comprehend that my judicial position actually increased my responsibility to maintain neutrality rather than providing opportunities to benefit relatives. The conversation continued for another hour, with David alternating between appeals to family loyalty, practical arguments about Michael's future prospects, and subtle implications that my refusal to help was somehow vindictive or unreasonable. He seemed genuinely confused by my insistence on maintaining professional boundaries, as if the concept of ethical obligations was an abstract principle rather than a concrete responsibility that governed my daily actions. Eventually, David accepted that I wouldn't provide the assistance the family was seeking, though his acceptance came with a layer of resentment that suggested this conversation had damaged our relationship in ways that might not be easily repaired. As he prepared for bed, his final comment revealed his true feelings about my professional priorities and their impact on our marriage. "I hope your judicial ethics are worth more to you than your family relationships," he said quietly, his words carrying a threat wrapped in apparent sadness. "Because this decision is going to have consequences that extend far beyond Michael's legal problems. The family is going to remember who was willing to help during a crisis and who chose to hide behind professional rules instead of standing by the people who matter most." That night, as I lay awake processing the events of the day, I realized that the situation with Michael's case had crystallized issues that had been developing in my marriage for years. David's request for unethical assistance and his reaction to my refusal revealed fundamental differences in our values and priorities that could no longer be overlooked or rationalized away. The Thompson family's sudden interest in my legal expertise, combined with their recent exclusion of me from family traditions, exposed a pattern of conditional acceptance that depended entirely on my usefulness to their interests. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. The same family that had deemed me unworthy of their Christmas Eve tradition was now hoping to exploit my professional position for their benefit. They wanted access to my knowledge and connections without offering genuine acceptance or respect, expecting me to compromise my integrity for people who had made it clear that I would never truly belong in their circle. As I prepared for Michael's court appearance the following morning, I felt a strange sense of anticipation mixed with professional determination. This case would test not only my ability to maintain judicial neutrality under difficult circumstances, but also my commitment to the principles that had guided my legal career. The Thompson family would soon discover that Judge Jessica Martinez was not the same accommodating woman they had dismissed from their family gathering, and that professional authority carried responsibilities that superseded personal relationships, regardless of the consequences. The morning of Michael's arraignment arrived with the kind of crisp January clarity that made everything seem sharper and more defined than usual. I dressed with particular care, choosing my most authoritative black judicial robe and ensuring that every detail of my appearance projected the dignity and gravitas appropriate for my position. The weight of the fabric as I adjusted it around my shoulders served as a physical reminder of the responsibilities I carried and the oath I had sworn to uphold justice without regard to personal relationships or family pressure. Maria Rodriguez had arranged the morning's docket with her usual efficiency, positioning Michael's case in the middle of the schedule to avoid any appearance that it was receiving special attention, either positive or negative. The courtroom filled gradually with the usual mix of defendants, attorneys, family members, and court personnel that characterized a typical arraignment session, though I noticed an unusual number of well-dressed individuals who seemed out of place among the standard crowd of people dealing with misdemeanor charges and traffic violations. Thomas Mitchell arrived precisely on time, his expensive suit and confident bearing immediately identifying him as one of the county's premier defense attorneys. His reputation for aggressive representation of high-profile clients was well established, and his presence in my courtroom for a routine DUI case suggested that the Thompson family was indeed treating this matter as a serious threat requiring maximum legal firepower. He moved with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to commanding attention and respect in legal settings, and I noticed how other attorneys seemed to defer to his presence as he organized his materials at the defense table. Michael entered, the courtroom flanked by his parents, his appearance carefully orchestrated to project responsibility and remorse, while maintaining the dignity expected of someone from his social background. His navy suit was perfectly tailored, his hair was neatly styled, and his expression carried the appropriate combination of seriousness and confidence that suggested he understood the gravity of the situation without appearing overly concerned about the outcome. Robert and Patricia Thompson took seats in the front row directly behind the defense table, their positioning designed to demonstrate family support while allowing them to monitor proceedings closely. The moment Patricia Thompson's eyes met mine across the courtroom, I witnessed a transformation that was both shocking and oddly satisfying. Her composed expression shifted through a series of emotions that played across her features like an accelerated film sequence. Confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally a kind of horrified realization that made her face drain of color despite her carefully applied makeup. She leaned forward slightly, as if proximity might change what she was seeing, before turning to whisper urgently to her husband with the kind of controlled panic that suggested she was struggling to maintain her composure in a public setting. Robert Thompson's reaction was more controlled but equally revealing. His business-trained poker face remained intact, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated he was rapidly calculating the implications of this unexpected development. His gaze moved from me to Michael to Thomas Mitchell, with the systematic assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating complex situations and formulating strategic responses under pressure. The confidence that had characterized his bearing when he entered the courtroom gradually gave way to something approaching wariness as he began to understand that the family's carefully planned legal strategy might need significant revision. Thomas Mitchell seemed initially unaware of the undercurrents flowing through his client's family, focused instead on his legal preparations and the routine procedures that would govern the morning's proceedings. However, his experienced courtroom instincts eventually detected the tension emanating from the Thompson family section, and I watched him turn to follow their fixed stares in my direction. When his eyes reached the bench and he fully processed what they had already discovered, his professional composure faltered for just a moment before training reasserted itself, and he resumed his preparation with slightly less confidence than he had displayed upon entering. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Jessica Martinez," announced Officer James Wilson, my bailiff, his voice carrying through the courtroom with the formal authority that marked the beginning of official proceedings. The familiar ritual of opening. Court felt different this morning, charged with personal significance that transformed routine procedures into something approaching theater. As the assembled crowd rose to their feet, I took my position behind the bench with the careful dignity that had become second nature during my years on the bench, though I was acutely aware that this particular session would test my professional composure in unprecedented ways. "Be seated," I instructed, my voice carrying clearly through the courtroom's sound system as I settled into the high-backed leather chair that served as both throne and burden for every judge who occupied it. The familiar weight of authority settled around me like a protective cloak, and I felt the transformation that occurred each time I assumed my judicial role, shifting from Jessica the person to Judge Martinez, the impartial arbiter of legal disputes. The distinction had never felt more important or more necessary than it did at that moment. The morning proceeded through several routine cases before Michael's name was called, each proceeding according to established protocols that demonstrated the careful structure and predictable rhythms that governed criminal court operations. I handled each case with the same professional attention and measured consideration that characterized my judicial approach, though I was conscious of the Thompson family's intense scrutiny as they evaluated my demeanor and decision-making patterns for clues about how I might approach their situation. "People versus Michael Thompson," Maria announced, her voice maintaining the neutral professionalism that characterized all court clerk communications. Michael rose from his seat behind the defense table and approached the defendant's podium, with the careful dignity that had obviously been coached by his attorney. His movements deliberate and respectful in a way that suggested extensive preparation for this moment. Thomas Mitchell joined him at the defense table, arranging his files with practiced efficiency while maintaining the confident bearing that had made him successful in high-stakes criminal defense work. Lisa Chen, the prosecuting attorney assigned to the case, took her position at the prosecution table with the kind of thorough preparation that characterized her approach to all criminal matters, regardless of their apparent complexity or the social status of the defendants involved. Her reputation for meticulous case preparation and fair but firm prosecution had earned respect throughout the legal community, and I knew that she would present the state's case based solely on evidence and legal merits without regard to political considerations or family connections that might influence other attorneys. "Mr. Thompson," I began, addressing Michael directly while maintaining the formal tone required for judicial proceedings, "you have been charged with driving under the influence of alcohol, a violation of Vehicle Code Section 23152, with enhancements for excessive blood alcohol content and reckless endangerment. Do you understand the charges that have been filed against you?" My voice carried no hint of the personal knowledge I possessed about the defendant or his family circumstances, reflecting instead the impartial professionalism that governed all my courtroom interactions. Michael's response was carefully modulated, his tone respectful and appropriately serious, while avoiding any suggestion of excessive deference that might seem calculated or insincere. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand the charges." His lawyers had obviously prepared him well for this moment, coaching him on the precise balance of respect and dignity that would create the most favorable impression without appearing to manipulate the proceedings through artificial displays of remorse or responsibility. Thomas Mitchell stepped forward to address the court on behalf of his client, his opening remarks designed to establish reasonable doubt about the prosecution's case while maintaining respect for the judicial process and avoiding any direct challenges to law enforcement procedures that might alienate the court. "Your Honor, Mr. Thompson intends to plead not guilty to all charges. We believe that examination of the evidence will reveal significant procedural irregularities in both the initial traffic stop and subsequent testing procedures that fundamentally compromise the reliability of the state's case." His strategy was immediately apparent, focusing on technical and procedural challenges rather than disputing the basic facts of Michael's arrest or blood alcohol measurements. This approach allowed the defense to maintain that Michael was innocent of wrongdoing while acknowledging that certain events had occurred, shifting responsibility to law enforcement errors rather than defendant behavior. It was a sophisticated legal strategy that required careful execution and thorough preparation, exactly the kind of approach that justified Thomas Mitchell's reputation and expensive fees. Lisa Chen responded with the measured confidence that characterized her prosecutorial style, presenting the state's position without unnecessary drama or emotional appeals that might distract from the legal merits of the case. "Your Honor, the people are confident that the evidence will demonstrate Mr. Thompson's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defendant was observed driving erratically at excessive speeds, failed multiple field sobriety tests, and registered a blood alcohol content significantly above the legal limit, using properly calibrated equipment operated by trained personnel following established protocols." Her summary was precise and factual, avoiding any inflammatory language while clearly establishing the strength of the prosecution's evidence and their confidence in the case's legal foundation. I appreciated her professional approach, which focused on legal standards and evidence, rather than attempting to influence proceedings through emotional manipulation or character assessments that had no relevance to the specific charges being addressed. The arraignment proceeded according to standard procedures, with both sides presenting their preliminary positions and requesting appropriate scheduling for pretrial motions and discovery proceedings. Throughout the formal exchanges, I maintained the neutral professionalism that characterized all my judicial interactions, treating Michael Thompson exactly as I would treat any other defendant facing similar charges regardless of personal relationships or family connections that might exist outside the courtroom. However, I was acutely aware of the intense scrutiny I was receiving from the Thompson family section, where Patricia and Robert sat with the kind of focused attention that suggested they were analyzing every word I spoke and every gesture I made for signs of bias either favorable or unfavorable to their son's case. Their obvious discomfort with finding themselves in a situation where their family's legal fate rested in the hands of someone they had recently excluded from their social circle created a tension that was palpable despite their efforts to maintain dignified composure. As the formal proceedings concluded and I scheduled the case for pretrial motion hearings in 3 weeks, I noticed Thomas Mitchell's request for a brief sidebar conference, a common procedural move that allowed attorneys to address administrative issues or scheduling concerns without consuming court time in open session. I granted the request, and both attorneys approached the bench for a whispered conference that would be inaudible to courtroom observers while remaining part of the official record. "Your Honor," Thomas Mitchell began quietly, his voice carrying the kind of professional diplomacy that experienced defense attorneys used when addressing potentially sensitive issues. "I want to ensure that there are no conflict of interest concerns regarding this case that might require disclosure or recusal consideration. I understand that Mr. Thompson may have family connections to the court that could create ethical complications if not properly addressed through appropriate channels." His carefully worded inquiry was designed to determine whether I had any personal relationship with his client that might affect my ability to judge the case fairly, a standard ethical concern that responsible attorneys raised whenever potential conflicts existed. However, his phrasing also suggested that he was fishing for information about the nature and extent of any family connections, possibly hoping to identify grounds for requesting my recusal if he determined that my relationship with Michael might work against his client's interests. Lisa Chen listened to this exchange with professional interest, understanding that conflict of interest issues could significantly impact case proceedings if not properly resolved at the outset. Her expression remained neutral, but I could see that she was prepared to address any ethical concerns that might arise from family relationships or personal connections that could compromise judicial impartiality. "Mr. Mitchell," I responded in the same quiet tone used for sidebar conferences, "I have reviewed the ethical implications of this case thoroughly and determined that no recusal is necessary. While Mr. Thompson is technically my brother-in-law, through marriage, our personal relationship is quite limited and presents no conflict that would prevent me from judging this case fairly based solely on evidence and legal merits presented in court. If you have specific concerns about potential bias, you may file appropriate motions through proper channels." My response was carefully crafted to provide the necessary information while making it clear that I had already considered the ethical dimensions thoroughly and reached a professional conclusion about my ability to handle the case appropriately. The phrase, "technically my brother-in-law," was particularly pointed, suggesting that whatever family connection existed was minimal and formal rather than close and personal, which accurately reflected the reality of my relationship with Michael and the Thompson family's recent treatment of me. Thomas Mitchell nodded his understanding, though I could see him processing the implications of my response and considering whether this information might influence his strategic approach to the case. Defense attorneys often preferred judges who had some positive connection to their clients, but in this situation, he was probably calculating whether my family relationship with Michael represented an asset or a liability, given the complex dynamics that might be involved. "Thank you for the clarification, Your Honor," he replied diplomatically. "The defense has no objection to Your Honor presiding over this case and looks forward to presenting our client's position through proper legal channels." His response was professionally appropriate while avoiding any commitment about whether he might later file motions challenging my involvement if he determined that my family connections worked against his client's interests. As the sidebar conference concluded and both attorneys returned to their respective tables, I announced the scheduling for pretrial motions and discovery deadlines, maintaining the same professional tone and procedural efficiency that characterized all my case management decisions. The formal conclusion of the arraignment provided an opportunity for the courtroom to clear as participants moved on to other business or departed for the day. But I noticed that the Thompson family remained, seated as if uncertain about appropriate protocol for their unprecedented situation. Michael approached his parents with obvious anxiety about their reaction to the morning's developments, his carefully maintained composure beginning to show cracks as he faced the reality of having his legal fate determined by someone his family had recently treated with such dismissive contempt. The irony of the situation was clearly not lost on any of the Thompson family members, though their individual reactions to this cosmic joke varied significantly based on their personalities and their role in the family's recent treatment of me. Patricia Thompson's shock had evolved into something approaching panic as she fully processed the implications of having her son's future dependent on the judicial decisions of a daughter-in-law she had systematically excluded and undermined. Her usual confidence in her ability to control situations through social influence and family connections was useless in this context, where legal procedures and professional ethics governed outcomes rather than personal relationships and community standing. Robert Thompson's business-trained analytical mind was obviously working through various scenarios and strategic options, though his usual confidence in finding leverage points and negotiating advantages was constrained by the formal structure of the legal system and the ethical boundaries that governed judicial interactions. His realization that his family's wealth and social connections provided no meaningful advantage in this situation was evident in his increasingly serious demeanor as he contemplated the limits of his influence. As I prepared to leave the bench and transition to my chambers for administrative work, I felt a complex mixture of professional satisfaction and personal vindication that surprised me with its intensity. The morning's proceedings had demonstrated that the legal system's commitment to impartial justice could function effectively, even when personal relationships and family dynamics created potential complications. More personally, the situation had provided an unexpected opportunity to demonstrate that professional competence and ethical integrity were more powerful and lasting than social acceptance or family approval. The transformation in the Thompson family's attitude toward me was already visible in the way they looked at me now compared to their dismissive treatment during the Christmas Eve dinner. Where they had previously seen someone who could be safely ignored or marginalized, they now confronted a person whose professional authority directly affected their family's interests and could not be influenced through their traditional methods of social pressure and conditional acceptance. Officer Wilson approached the bench as the courtroom cleared, his experienced eye having noted the unusual dynamics surrounding the Thompson case without requiring detailed explanation of the personal relationships involved. "Interesting morning, Your Honor," he observed quietly, his comment carrying the kind of diplomatic understatement that characterized his professional communication style. The family seemed particularly invested in observing courtroom procedures today. His observation was both astute and tactful, acknowledging the obvious tension without prying into personal matters that might compromise my professional position or create inappropriate discussions about case-related issues. I appreciated his discretion and professionalism, which reflected the kind of supportive working relationship that made difficult situations more manageable. "Indeed it was, Officer Wilson," I replied with equal diplomacy. "I expect we'll see continued interest in proper legal procedures as this case moves forward through the system." My response acknowledged his observation while maintaining appropriate boundaries about discussing case specifics or personal relationships that might influence proceedings. As I gathered my materials and prepared to return to my chambers, I reflected on how dramatically the power dynamics between myself and the Thompson family had shifted in the space of a single morning. The same people who had deemed me unworthy of their family traditions now found themselves dependent on my professional judgment and ethical integrity, forced to trust that I would treat their son fairly despite their recent treatment of me. The weeks following Michael's arraignment unleashed a campaign of pressure and manipulation that revealed the true nature of the Thompson family's character more clearly than years of social gatherings ever had. What began as subtle inquiries about my well-being and professional workload gradually escalated into increasingly desperate attempts to influence my handling of Michael's case through every available channel except direct communication with me. David's behavior during this period was perhaps the most devastating aspect of the entire ordeal. As I watched my husband transform from someone I thought I knew into a person whose primary loyalty clearly lay with his birth family rather than our marriage partnership. His initial attempts to discuss the case were couched in terms of general curiosity about legal procedures and judicial decision-making, but the underlying agenda became increasingly transparent as his questions grew more specific and his frustration with my professional boundaries more evident. "You have to understand the position this puts our family in," he said during one particularly tense dinner conversation at our Oak Valley townhouse, his voice carrying the kind of strained reasonableness that indicated he was struggling to maintain composure. "Michael's entire future is at stake here. His law career, his reputation, his ability to contribute meaningfully to the family business. One mistake shouldn't destroy everything he's worked to achieve, especially when there are legitimate questions about whether proper procedures were followed during his arrest." His framing of the situation as a family crisis requiring collective response rather than a legal matter requiring impartial judicial consideration revealed how completely he had internalized the Thompson family's perspective on the appropriate relationship between personal loyalty and professional obligation. In David's worldview, my refusal to provide special consideration for Michael represented a betrayal of fundamental family values rather than adherence to ethical standards that governed my professional conduct. The pressure campaign extended far beyond David's direct appeals, incorporating a sophisticated network of social and professional contacts that demonstrated the Thompson family's understanding of how influence operated within Riverside County's interconnected elite circles. Patricia Thompson, despite her obvious discomfort with having to rely on someone she had recently dismissed from family gatherings, orchestrated a series of seemingly casual encounters designed to remind me of the social consequences that might result from decisions that adversely affected the Thompson family's interests. These encounters occurred at carefully chosen venues, where our paths would naturally cross during routine activities, creating opportunities for brief conversations that appeared spontaneous while being obviously orchestrated. The Riverside Country Club, where I occasionally attended professional networking events, suddenly became a frequent destination for Patricia's charity planning meetings that seemed to require her presence precisely when my calendar indicated I would be there for legal community gatherings. "Jessica, dear," she would say with practiced warmth during these manufactured encounters, her tone carrying the kind of concerned affection that might fool casual observers while conveying more complex messages to the intended recipient. "I do hope you're managing the stress of your demanding professional responsibilities. It must be so difficult to maintain objectivity when dealing with cases that touch on personal relationships. I'm sure your judicial training has prepared you for these challenging situations, though I can't imagine how emotionally taxing it must be." Her words were carefully constructed to sound supportive, while actually applying pressure through subtle reminders of the personal costs associated with professional decisions that might displease the Thompson family. The implication that maintaining judicial neutrality was somehow emotionally damaging rather than professionally necessary reflected her fundamental misunderstanding of judicial ethics and her assumption that personal relationships should naturally override professional obligations. More concerning were the indirect approaches made through my professional network, as various colleagues and acquaintances began raising questions about my handling of high-profile cases and the importance of maintaining community relationships while serving in judicial roles. These conversations never mentioned Michael's case directly, but they consistently emphasized themes of discretion, community harmony, and the delicate balance required when legal decisions affected prominent local families. Judge Eleanor Hayes proved invaluable during this period, her experience with similar pressures providing both practical guidance and emotional support as I navigated the complex dynamics surrounding Michael's case. During one of our regular coffee meetings, she addressed the situation with characteristic directness, while maintaining appropriate professional boundaries about discussing specific cases or personal relationships. The most dangerous aspect of judicial service isn't the complex legal issues or the difficult sentencing decisions, she observed, stirring cream into her coffee while studying my face with perceptive concern. It's the constant pressure to compromise professional integrity for personal convenience or social harmony. Every judge faces situations where doing the right thing legally creates complications in other areas of life. The test isn't whether these pressures exist, but how we respond to them when they do. Her words provided both validation and challenge, acknowledging the difficulty of my situation while reinforcing the importance of maintaining professional standards regardless of personal costs. Judge Hayes had faced her own challenges throughout her career, breaking barriers and establishing precedents while dealing with social pressures that were rarely discussed openly, but were understood by anyone who had navigated similar territory. The community will remember how you handle this situation long after the specific case details are forgotten, she continued, her tone carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. Your response to pressure will define your judicial legacy more than any individual decision you make from the bench. People are watching to see whether Judge Martinez can be influenced through personal relationships or whether she maintains the integrity that earned her this position. Meanwhile, Thomas Mitchell's legal strategy became increasingly aggressive as pretrial motions approached, filing challenge after challenge designed to exclude evidence, question procedures, and create reasonable doubt about every aspect of the prosecution's case. His approach was professionally competent, but unusually combative for a routine DUI case, suggesting that the Thompson family's resources were being deployed to maximum effect in defense of their golden boy. The defense motions attacked everything from the initial traffic stop to the calibration records of the breathalyzer equipment, creating a comprehensive challenge to law enforcement procedures that went far beyond the standard defenses typically employed in similar cases. Mitchell's strategy was clearly designed to overwhelm the prosecution with technical challenges while creating multiple opportunities for procedural errors that might result in case dismissal or evidence suppression. Lisa Chen responded to these challenges with characteristic thoroughness, producing detailed documentation and expert testimony that supported every aspect of the state's case, while maintaining professional courtesy despite the defense's aggressive tactics. Her preparation was meticulous, and her legal arguments were sound, creating a strong foundation for prosecution that would be difficult to undermine through technical challenges or procedural objections. The first pretrial hearing arrived with unusual media attention, as local news outlets had picked up on the story of a prominent family's legal troubles and the interesting judicial connection that added human drama to what might otherwise have been a routine criminal case. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and cameras when I arrived for work that morning, their presence transforming the normally quiet judicial building into something resembling a media circus. Officer Wilson had coordinated with courthouse security to manage the increased attention while maintaining appropriate access for legitimate court business, his experience with high-profile cases proving valuable as he balanced public interest with the need to preserve courtroom dignity and security. The media presence added another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation, as every decision I made would now be scrutinized not just by the immediate parties, but by a broader public audience. The courtroom was packed beyond its normal capacity, with Thompson family members occupying an entire section, while curious observers filled every available seat to witness what promised to be an unprecedented legal drama. I noticed several familiar faces from Riverside's legal and social communities, their presence indicating that this case had become a topic of widespread interest and speculation throughout the county's interconnected professional networks. Michael entered the courtroom with the same carefully orchestrated dignity that had characterized his arraignment appearance, though the stress of prolonged legal proceedings and media attention was beginning to show in subtle ways that suggested the confident facade was becoming more difficult to maintain. His parents flanked him with expressions of determined support, but I could see the strain in their posture and demeanor as they faced the reality of their reduced influence in this particular arena. Thomas Mitchell's opening arguments for his various motions were delivered with professional competence but unusual intensity, his presentation suggesting that he understood the high stakes involved in this case for both his client and his own reputation. His challenges to the traffic stop focused on questions of reasonable suspicion and proper procedure, arguing that Officer Martinez had lacked sufficient justification for initiating the stop that led to Michael's arrest. Your Honor, Mitchell began with practiced confidence. The evidence will clearly demonstrate that my client was targeted for enforcement action based on the make and model of his vehicle and the late hour of his travel rather than any observed traffic violations or legitimate safety concerns. The subsequent investigation was tainted from its inception by an unlawful detention that violated Mr. Thompson's constitutional rights and renders any evidence obtained inadmissible under the exclusionary rule. His argument was professionally crafted and legally sophisticated, presenting a constitutional challenge that required careful consideration of Fourth Amendment principles and their application to traffic enforcement procedures. However, the underlying premise seemed designed more to create reasonable doubt about the prosecution's case than to address genuine constitutional violations, reflecting the kind of aggressive defense strategy that wealthy defendants could afford. But that might not be available to less privileged individuals facing similar charges. Lisa Chen's response was measured and factual, presenting detailed evidence about the specific circumstances that had justified the initial traffic stop and the subsequent investigation procedures. Her presentation included dashboard camera footage from the arresting officer's vehicle, radio communications that documented the sequence of events, and expert testimony about standard police procedures for detecting and investigating suspected impaired driving. Your Honor, she replied with professional composure, the evidence clearly establishes that Officer Martinez observed the defendant's vehicle traveling at excessive speeds and weaving between lanes in a manner that created immediate safety concerns for other motorists. The traffic stop was conducted according to established protocols, and the subsequent investigation followed proper procedures for detecting and documenting impaired driving behavior. Her presentation was thorough and well documented, providing a strong factual foundation that would be difficult to challenge through technical objections or constitutional arguments. The dashboard camera footage was particularly compelling, showing Michael's vehicle behavior in ways that clearly justified police intervention, regardless of the time of day or the type of car he was driving. As I reviewed the arguments and evidence presented by both sides, I found myself grateful for the extensive legal training and judicial experience that allowed me to evaluate the case based solely on its legal merits, rather than being influenced by the personal relationships and family pressures that surrounded these proceedings. The constitutional principles at stake were important, regardless of the defendant's identity, and my obligation was to apply them consistently based on established legal precedents and factual evidence. The defense's motion to suppress evidence based on Fourth Amendment violations required careful analysis of the specific circumstances surrounding Michael's arrest, compared to established legal standards for traffic stops and impaired driving investigations. While Thomas Mitchell's arguments were professionally presented, they seemed to stretch constitutional protections beyond their established boundaries in ways that might create problematic precedents if accepted. After reviewing all the arguments and evidence, I denied the defense motion to suppress evidence, finding that the traffic stop had been conducted with appropriate legal justification and that subsequent investigation procedures had followed established protocols. My decision was based entirely on legal analysis and factual evidence, though I was aware that it would be disappointing to the Thompson family and might increase the personal pressures I was already experiencing. The court finds that Officer Martinez had reasonable suspicion based on observed traffic violations to initiate the traffic stop in question, I announced, my voice carrying the formal authority that characterized judicial pronouncements. The subsequent investigation procedures followed established protocols and did not violate the defendant's constitutional rights. The defense motion to suppress evidence is therefore denied. Thomas Mitchell's expression remained professionally neutral despite the setback, though I could see him calculating the impact of this ruling on his overall defense strategy. The denial of his suppression motion meant that the prosecution's evidence would remain intact, making it more difficult to create reasonable doubt about Michael's guilt through technical challenges. The Thompson family's reaction to my ruling was visible despite their efforts to maintain dignified composure. Patricia's face tightened with displeasure that she struggled to conceal, while Robert's business-trained poker face showed subtle signs of concern about the direction of the case. Michael himself seemed to deflate slightly as he realized that his family's influence and expensive legal representation were not providing the protection he had expected. As the hearing concluded and the courtroom began to clear, I noticed David, sitting in the back section with an expression that combined disappointment, frustration, and something that might have been dawning respect for my professional integrity. His presence at the hearing had surprised me, as he had not mentioned planning to attend, and his demeanor suggested that he was beginning to understand that his wife was not the accommodating woman he thought he had married. The aftermath of the hearing brought increased pressure from multiple directions, as the Thompson family's desperation became more evident, and their attempts to influence the case's outcome grew more direct and inappropriate. Phone calls to my chambers increased dramatically, with various family friends and business associates requesting meetings to discuss community concerns about high-profile legal cases and their impact on local relationships. These requests were always framed in general terms that avoided direct mention of Michael's case, but the timing and the identity of the callers made their true purpose transparent. The Thompson family was mobilizing every connection and resource they possessed in a last-ditch effort to influence my judicial decisions through social pressure and professional intimidation. Maria Rodriguez proved invaluable during this period, her experience and discretion allowing her to screen these communications while maintaining appropriate professional protocols. Her ability to deflect inappropriate requests while preserving legitimate court business helped protect the integrity of the judicial process, while allowing me to focus on my legal responsibilities rather than managing constant interruptions. Judge Martinez, she reported during one particularly busy afternoon, "We've received 16 requests for meetings this week from individuals claiming to represent community interests in maintaining positive relationships between the court and prominent local families. I've informed all callers that judicial decisions are based solely on legal evidence and that ex parte communications about pending cases are prohibited by ethical guidelines." Her summary of the pressure campaign was both informative and reassuring, demonstrating that the court's administrative systems were functioning properly to protect judicial independence, despite unprecedented attempts to circumvent established procedures. The sheer volume of these contacts revealed the extent of the Thompson family's desperation and their willingness to cross ethical boundaries in their efforts to protect Michael from the consequences of his actions. As the case moved toward trial, I realized that my handling of this situation would indeed define my judicial legacy in ways that extended far beyond the specific legal issues involved. The Thompson family's pressure campaign had created a test of judicial independence and integrity that would be remembered long after the details of Michael's drunk driving case were forgotten, and my response would send a message to the entire legal community about whether Judge Jessica Martinez could be influenced through personal relationships or would maintain the professional standards that justified public trust in the judicial system. The trial of People versus Michael Thompson began on a cold February morning that seemed to crystallize all the tensions and conflicts that had been building over the previous months into a single moment of reckoning. As I entered the courthouse that day, I carried with me not just the weight of judicial responsibility, but the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had finally learned to distinguish between authentic respect and conditional acceptance, between genuine partnership and manipulative control. The courtroom was filled to capacity with an audience that represented a cross-section of Riverside County's legal, social, and business communities, all drawn by the unprecedented drama of watching a prominent family's fate decided by someone they had systematically excluded and underestimated. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone present, least of all the Thompson family members who sat in their designated section, with expressions that ranged from resigned dignity to barely concealed resentment. Michael had aged visibly. During the months of legal proceedings, the confident young man who had arrived late to Christmas Eve dinner, now replaced by someone who understood that his privileged background offered no protection from the consequences of his choices. His expensive suit and carefully styled appearance could not entirely mask the anxiety that had become his constant companion as he faced the possibility of real accountability for the first time in his 26 years of existence. Thomas Mitchell's opening statement was a masterpiece of legal rhetoric, designed to portray his client as the victim of an overzealous criminal justice system that had targeted him based on his social status, rather than his actual behavior. His narrative painted Michael as a responsible young professional who had made a minor error in judgment that was being blown out of proportion by prosecutors seeking to make an example of someone from a prominent family. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Mitchell began with practiced sincerity, his voice carrying the kind of persuasive authority that had made him successful in high-stakes criminal defense work. "This case is not about drunk driving. This case is about a rush to judgment by law enforcement officers who saw an expensive car driven by a young man from a well-known family and decided to teach him a lesson. The evidence will show that Mr. Thompson was not impaired, that the testing procedures were flawed, and that he is the victim of selective enforcement based on his family's prominence in our community. His strategy was sophisticated and carefully crafted, acknowledging the basic facts of Michael's arrest while reframing them in a way that shifted responsibility from the defendant to the criminal justice system itself. The approach required delicate handling to avoid alienating jurors who might resent suggestions that wealthy defendants deserved special treatment, while simultaneously creating sympathy for a young man whose future had been derailed by what Mitchell characterized as prosecutorial overreach. Lisa Chen's opening statement provided a stark contrast in both style and substance, her presentation focusing on facts and evidence rather than emotional appeals or character assassination. Her approach reflected a deep understanding of how justice actually worked, emphasizing the importance of equal treatment under the law regardless of social status or family connections. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began with quiet confidence, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had built her career on thorough preparation and ethical practice. "This case is about personal responsibility and public safety. The evidence will show that Mr. Thompson chose to drive while significantly impaired by alcohol, endangering himself and every other person on Pacific Coast Highway that night. His blood alcohol content was nearly twice the legal limit. His driving behavior created immediate safety hazards, and his actions violated laws that exist to protect all members of our community." Her presentation was methodical and compelling, presenting a clear narrative supported by physical evidence, expert testimony, and documented procedures that would be difficult to challenge through technical objections or emotional manipulation. The contrast between her straightforward approach and Mitchell's elaborate defense strategy highlighted the fundamental difference between seeking justice and avoiding accountability. The prosecution's case unfolded with systematic precision. Over 3 days, each piece of evidence building upon the previous testimony to create an overwhelming picture of Michael's guilt. Officer Martinez, the arresting officer, testified about the dangerous driving behavior he had observed, the clear signs of impairment during the traffic stop, and the proper procedures he had followed during the arrest and testing process. The dashboard camera footage proved particularly damaging to the defense case, showing Michael's vehicle weaving between lanes and traveling at speeds that clearly endangered other motorists. The video evidence was objective and undeniable, providing visual confirmation of the dangerous behavior that had prompted the initial traffic stop and subsequent investigation. Dr. Sarah Williams, the forensic toxicologist who had analyzed Michael's blood samples, testified about the scientific accuracy of the testing procedures and the significance of his blood alcohol readings. Her expert testimony established that Michael's impairment level was severe enough to substantially compromise his driving ability and reaction time, creating serious risks for himself and other road users. Based on the blood alcohol concentration of 0.14 measured in Mr. Thompson's blood sample, Dr. Williams explained with scientific precision, I can conclude that his cognitive function, motor coordination, and judgment would have been significantly impaired at the time of his arrest. This level of impairment creates substantial risks for anyone attempting to operate a motor vehicle safely. Her testimony was particularly effective because it focused on objective scientific evidence rather than subjective interpretations of behavior or character. The blood alcohol measurements provided quantifiable proof of impairment that could not be explained away through alternative theories or character references. The defense case relied heavily on challenging the credibility and accuracy of the prosecution's evidence rather than presenting alternative explanations for Michael's behavior. Mitchell called expert witnesses who questioned the calibration of testing equipment, suggested alternative explanations for the observed driving patterns, and argued that Michael's blood alcohol level might have been lower at the time of driving than when the tests were conducted. Dr. Richard Stone, a defense expert in forensic toxicology, testified about potential variations in blood alcohol absorption and elimination that might affect the accuracy of test results obtained hours after the alleged driving occurred. His testimony was technically competent but seemed designed more to create confusion than to provide credible alternative explanations for the prosecution's evidence. Blood alcohol concentrations can vary significantly based on individual metabolism, food consumption, and the timing of alcohol consumption relative to driving, Dr. Stone explained during his direct examination. Without knowing the exact timing and circumstances of Mr. Thompson's alcohol consumption, we cannot definitively establish his blood alcohol level at the time he was driving, rather than when he was tested several hours later. However, Lisa Chen's cross-examination effectively undermined his testimony by establishing that even under the most favorable assumptions about timing and metabolism, Michael's blood alcohol level would still have been substantially above the legal limit during the period when he was driving. Her questioning was precise and methodical, using Dr. Stone's own expert opinions to demonstrate that Michael had been significantly impaired regardless of the technical variables the defense was attempting to exploit. Throughout the trial proceedings, I maintained the strict impartiality that characterized all my judicial decisions, ruling on evidentiary questions and procedural matters based solely on legal standards without regard to the personal relationships and family pressures that surrounded this case. Each ruling was carefully considered and thoroughly documented, ensuring that the proceedings would withstand any appellate review, regardless of the verdict ultimately reached by the jury. The Thompson family's behavior during the trial revealed the depth of their desperation and their inability to accept that their influence and social connections were irrelevant in this particular arena. Patricia Thompson attended every day of testimony with an expression of barely concealed hostility, her usual social composure replaced by obvious resentment toward the judicial process that was threatening her son's future. Her presence in the courtroom felt like a form of psychological pressure designed to remind me of the personal costs associated with decisions that adversely affected her family's interests. Robert Thompson's approach was more subtle but equally manipulative, his business-trained analytical mind clearly working through various scenarios and contingency plans as he witnessed the systematic destruction of his son's defense case. His occasional nods of apparent approval when I made procedural rulings that favored the defense seemed calculated to suggest that cooperation with Thompson family interests might be remembered and rewarded in future social and professional contexts. David's attendance at the trial created the most complex emotional dynamics, as I watched my husband struggle to reconcile his loyalty to his birth family with his growing recognition that his wife was demonstrating integrity and competence that exceeded anything he had previously understood about my character. His expression during key moments of testimony suggested that he was seeing me clearly for the first time, recognizing the professional authority and ethical commitment that had always been central to my identity. but that he had somehow failed to appreciate during our years of marriage. The jury deliberations lasted 8 hours, a relatively brief period for a case involving such serious charges and extensive expert testimony. When they returned with their verdict, the tension in the courtroom was palpable as everyone present understood that this moment would have consequences extending far beyond Michael's immediate legal fate. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" I asked the foreman, a middle-aged construction supervisor whose practical demeanor had suggested throughout the trial that he was focused on facts rather than social dynamics or family connections. "We have, Your Honor," he replied with quiet dignity. "We find the defendant guilty on all charges." The words seemed to echo through the courtroom with unusual clarity, their finality creating a moment of absolute silence before the inevitable. Emotional reactions began. Michael's face went pale as he processed the reality of his conviction, while his parents struggled to maintain composure despite the devastating blow to their family's reputation and his future prospects. Thomas Mitchell's professional mask remained intact despite his obvious disappointment with the verdict. His experience with high-stakes criminal defense having taught him to accept unfavorable outcomes while preserving relationships for potential future appeals or sentencing negotiations. His immediate focus shifted to damage control and mitigation strategies that might minimize the consequences of his client's conviction. Lisa Chen's satisfaction with the verdict was evident, but restrained, her professional demeanor reflecting an understanding that justice had been served rather than a personal victory over a prominent family. Her handling of the case had demonstrated that prosecutorial integrity and thorough preparation could overcome even the most expensive defense strategies when supported by solid evidence and proper procedures. The sentencing phase of the proceedings required careful consideration of multiple factors, including Michael's lack of prior criminal history, the seriousness of his offense, and the need to demonstrate that equal justice applied regardless of social status or family connections. I had reviewed similar cases extensively to ensure that my sentencing decision would be consistent with established precedents while reflecting the specific circumstances of Michael's conviction. "Mr. Thompson," I began as he stood before the bench for sentencing, his expensive suit and careful grooming unable to disguise the reality of his situation. "You have been convicted of driving under the influence with enhancements for excessive blood alcohol content and reckless endangerment. These are serious offenses that endangered not only your own life, but the lives of innocent people who shared the roadway with you that night." My words were delivered with the formal authority that characterized judicial proceedings, but they carried additional weight given the personal dynamics that surrounded this case. The Thompson family was finally receiving a clear demonstration that their social status and family connections could not shield them from the consequences of illegal behavior. The sentence of this court is 90 days in county jail with credit for time served, 2 years supervised probation, completion of an alcohol education program, and suspension of your driving privileges for 1 year. Additionally, you will perform 100 hours of community service at organizations that deal with the consequences of drunk driving, and you will pay all court costs and fees associated with your prosecution. The sentence was consistent with standard penalties for similar offenses, reflecting neither favoritism nor excessive harshness based on Michael's family background. My decision was based entirely on legal precedents and the specific facts of his case, demonstrating that judicial neutrality could function effectively even when personal relationships created potential conflicts of interest. Michael's reaction to his sentence was a mixture of relief that he had avoided more severe penalties and shock at receiving any meaningful consequences for behavior that had previously been excused or minimized by his family. His parents' expressions revealed their struggle to accept that their son would actually serve jail time and face real restrictions on his future activities. As the formal proceedings concluded and the courtroom began to clear, I reflected on the broader implications of this case for my understanding of justice, integrity, and authentic relationships. The Thompson family's treatment of me throughout this ordeal had provided invaluable lessons about the difference between conditional acceptance based on utility and genuine respect based on character and competence. David approached the bench. As I gathered my materials, his expression revealing a complex mixture of emotions that suggested he was still processing the implications of everything he had witnessed during the trial. "Jess," he said quietly, using my nickname for the first time in months, "I need to apologize for a lot of things. I never really understood who you are or what your work means until I watched you handle this situation." His words carried genuine remorse and dawning recognition, though I understood that our relationship had been fundamentally altered by the events of the past months in ways that might not be easily repaired. The person he was apologizing to was not the accommodating wife he thought he had married, but a woman who had reclaimed her authentic identity through standing firm in her professional principles despite enormous personal pressure. The aftermath of Michael's convictions sent ripples throughout Riverside County's social and professional communities, creating a precedent that would influence how future cases involving prominent families were perceived and handled. The legal community recognized that Judge Jessica Martinez had demonstrated judicial independence and integrity under unprecedented pressure, establishing her reputation as someone who could not be influenced through personal relationships or social connections. Judge Eleanor Hayes's assessment of the situation proved prophetic when she observed that my handling of this case would define my judicial legacy more than any individual decision I might make from the bench. The Thompson case had become a defining moment that demonstrated the possibility of maintaining professional integrity even when personal costs were severe, providing an example that would influence other judges facing similar pressures. Patricia Thompson's social circle began treating me with a grudging respect that had never existed during my years of attempting to earn their acceptance through accommodation and compliance. The transformation in their attitude revealed that authentic authority commanded recognition in ways that desperate efforts to fit in never could, and that professional competence ultimately carried more weight than social conformity. The most significant personal revelation came from my understanding that the boundaries I had fought so hard to maintain were not limitations on my freedom, but the foundation of my authentic power. The invisible constraints that had defined my relationship with the Thompson family had been self-imposed through my desire for acceptance rather than externally mandated through their social authority. My grandmother's legal legacy had provided essential guidance during this challenging period, though her most valuable gift had been the example of a woman who built her career on competence and integrity rather than accommodation and compromise. Her professional achievements had created opportunities for me that would have been impossible if she had chosen to minimize her identity in pursuit of social acceptance. The emerald earrings I wore during sentencing were not expensive jewelry, but symbols of authentic strength that came from standing firm in my convictions, rather than bending to external pressure. Like my grandmother before me, I had learned that real power came from ethical integrity and professional competence, rather than social positioning and family connections. As I returned to my chambers after Michael's sentencing, I felt a profound sense of completion that extended beyond the successful conclusion of a difficult case. The woman who had been excluded from the Thompson family's Christmas Eve tradition had emerged from this trial as someone who no longer needed their acceptance or approval to validate her worth and authority. The transformation was not just professional but deeply personal, representing a fundamental shift from seeking validation through others' approval to deriving confidence from my own integrity and competence. The Thompson family's attempt to manipulate and pressure me had ultimately served to clarify my values and strengthen my commitment to the principles that truly mattered. Maria Rodriguez knocked softly on my chamber door as I finished reviewing the day's final administrative tasks, her expression carrying the kind of professional satisfaction that came from witnessing justice served effectively despite complex personal dynamics. "Judge Martinez," she said with quiet pride, "I thought you should know that the legal community is already discussing this case as an example of judicial independence at its finest. Your handling of the situation has earned widespread respect." Her words provided confirmation that my professional reputation had been enhanced rather than damaged by my refusal to compromise ethical standards for personal convenience. The respect of my colleagues and the broader legal community represented a form of validation that was far more meaningful and lasting than any social acceptance the Thompson family might have offered. The journey from exclusion at a Christmas Eve dinner to delivering justice from the bench had taught me that authentic power came from integrity rather than accommodation, from professional competence rather than social positioning, and from maintaining clear boundaries rather than seeking approval through compromise. The Thompson family had inadvertently provided me with the greatest gift possible: the opportunity to discover who I truly was when stripped of the need for their acceptance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.